Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Leveraging Public Opinion in Support of Science. This is the first of a series of 4 webinars brought to you by Research America and Society for Neuroscience. My name is Ana Briceño. I'm the Senior Communications Manager at Research America. Research America is a not-for-profit advocacy alliance, and we're thrilled to partner with SFN to bring you today's webinar. Thank you, SFN, for your support and for hosting the webinar on Neuroline. Now, before I introduce the speakers, I want to let you know that you have the opportunity to submit questions by typing it into the questions pane. You may send your questions during any time of the presentation, and we'll collect these and try to address as many as possible during the audience Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. We have 3 outstanding speakers for you today. Mary Woolley, President and CEO of Research America, who will share national public opinion survey data commissioned by Research America. Christopher Volpe, Executive Director of ScienceCounts. He'll share key findings from a benchmark study on public perceptions of science. And Navneet Matharu. She's a bioengineer postdoctorate fellow at the University of California, San Francisco. She will share her experience with the 3-minute thesis in science communication. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mary Woolley, President and CEO of Research America, to kick off today's webinar. Mary?
Thank you, Anna, and hello, everyone. And my thanks to the Society for Neuroscience for being such a terrific partner over many decades now. So the frame of my remarks today is really about public opinion, why we pay attention to it, and how to leverage it. There's going to be lots of good or pretty good news to share with you, but also some less good news, which in combination with the current climate right now kind of underscores why getting science communication right is so very important. Now here you see a quote from President Lincoln over 150 years ago talking about how public sentiment or public opinion is really everything. It's the ball game. If the public is not on our side, it doesn't matter how lofty our goals are or even how hard we work at achieving them. So it's really important to keep a finger on the pulse of public opinion. Now, we aren't the only organization that regularly commissions public opinion surveys. There are others as well, notably the Pew Research Center. And you can see here in their work that trust in science, medical science, slightly higher than science overall, is strong. And you should always, in public opinion polling, always combine the great deal and a fair amount because there is data that shows that many people in the public will never say the most extreme, whether it's very great deal or no confidence at all, but we'll choose a more middling response. So adding the two is the convention here. So you can see that when you add a great deal and a fair amount, there's very strong levels of trust or confidence, if you will, in the groups that we all come from and talk to all the time. Now, it's also a fact from the Pew surveys that the majority, the 2/3 majority, say that science has a mostly positive effect on society, and then followed by another quarter plus who believe that there's been an equally positive and negative effect. And I think a fair-minded reading of science would say that that's absolutely right on track, true. So these are very strong positives from the public. Now, a little bit of the work that we've commissioned over many years, almost 3 decades now, which uses the same methodology that Pew and others do. First of all, this is a question about basic research that actually was first asked by the National Science Board starting back in the early part of the 1980s, and the response levels have not changed in any significant ways since that time. We asked the question exactly verbatim as it was first designed and used in, I believe, 1982. So you see here that kind of contrary to what the basic science community sometimes experiences anecdotally or believes, public support for basic science is quite robust. Now, here's a question. I'll show you the question before the response that tests whether the public agrees or disagrees that public policies should be based on the best available science. And you can see that the answer is yes. We'd all like it to be 100%, but it's actually quite strong. And the percentage of don't knows is an opportunity for change in the positive direction. But you can also see here that there is central parity in those who say that they are more likely to vote as a Democrat or as a Republican compared to independents who tend to be less supportive of government generally and public policies generally. So this is not a surprise that independents are less supportive. On the next slide, you can see that, and remember to add agree and strongly agree together here. You can see that people believe that scientists should play a major role in policy for a quite broad range of things, quite a broad range. Down at the bottom, job creation is the lowest on this particular number of fields that we asked about, but there it's almost 50%. And this is very different than what is actually happening. As I'm sure everyone realizes, that scientists don't play a major role in policy conversations about all of these issues typically. But it's the public believes that the science community should play such a role. And we have, I think, an obligation to go more than halfway in meeting that expectation and not just sit around waiting for policymakers to come to us. So you see on the next slide that it's important that elected officials at all levels listen to the advice from scientists. In this slide, you can see a marked increase since just 2 years previously. We don't often see that profound an increase or decrease, for that matter, in questions that we've been that have been part of commission surveys for years and years. This is quite striking that there's an increase in very important about listening to science and scientists. So this is all, I would say, very, very good news. Further, it's clear that the public wants scientists to take the initiative, I would put it, to inform elected officials and the public. And this, again, we see a striking increase compared to just a few years ago. And this goes to the point of more than meeting policymakers halfway, really be much more engaged and assertive in time to come. So that's the good news. But there is some less good news out there. And I categorize it in general around the relative invisibility of scientists in our society. So let's think about the question here, and you can imagine, if you will, how a general sample of the American population might answer this question. Can you give me the name of a living scientist? Can you give me the name of a living scientist? Well, it turns out that only 19% of the public say that yes, they can, and you can see here which names are given. Now, this is just about the same percentage saying yes that it was 20 years ago. So there hasn't been noticeable increase in that percentage. We have a ways to go to get to the point where a majority even of the public could give the name of a living scientist. And as a sidebar here, let me just say that some names that are given are names of scientists who are, in fact, not living, but that is less the point than trying to get to a higher level of recognition of being able to picture, being able to identify who a scientist is in our society. Here's another question, also disturbing, I think. Do Americans know where research is conducted? Well, in this case, now we're focusing on medical and health research specifically, I might add. Only a third of the American public can name any place where medical or health research is conducted. This is not a difficult question. You would think that people might give the name of one of the universities in their state, might think perhaps that a medical center in their community conducted research, which might be true, might not also. But the point is that only 1/3 can name a place where medical or health research is conducted. That's really very discouraging. And it's made even underscored again in a more political sense as well in the next slide, which is asking whether people believe, to the best of their knowledge, that medical research is conducted in all 50 states, which in fact it is. Now, the reason I said that this is politically important is that there are, as you know, representatives and senators from every state voting every year, and right now, in fact, on policies and on funding that affects medical research in all of the 50 states. But if their very own constituents, the people who live in those states, do not realize that medical research is happening right in their backyard, so to speak, in their own state, this is reflected then in not voting as though they expect their elected representatives to pay attention to research, and not ever asking questions about it in town hall meetings. So this goes on. This invisibility problem is very real for the science community, and it is amenable to change through meeting members of the non-science trained public more than halfway, including policymakers. In fact, failing to do so, we believe, at Research America, failing to be an advocate could be hazardous to your very own research career. Being an advocate, connecting to people, is about engaging hearts and minds, building relationships, aligning with aspiration, and making engagement in public outreach the new normal for the science community. And I think Chris is going to give you, I know Chris is going to give you more good reasons to get engaged. I'll close by just reinforcing what to us are the 4 most important words that a researcher can say and convey. And that's, I work for you. It means being accountable. It means being engaged. It means listening. It means communicating to win both hearts and minds. And indeed, that's the way we think at Research America about working for the community whose science we support, all of you. So I look forward to talking with you all further, but for now, I want to turn it over to our next speaker.
Thank you, Mary. Now we're going to turn it over to Christopher Volpe, the Executive Director of ScienceCounts. Chris?
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Mary. Good afternoon, everyone. And I just before I begin, I want to thank the Society for Neuroscience and Research America for inviting me to share some of my thoughts and some latest emerging research on the issue of science communication, and specifically the element of science communication that has to do with compelling or bolstering public support for science in a way that translates to material support, which is mostly money, but there are other resources, of course, human resources that are required to get science done. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my organization, but first, in science communication, there's a couple of laws. The first law is know thy audience, and the second is know thyself. And know thyself means know exactly how your audience is looking at you, because what you say is not always what they hear. And so just quickly to frame my perspective on this issue, I am a chemist and physicist by education, but I've spent about 20 years as an entrepreneur, primarily as a marketer, in the science education and outreach space. And as you're going to hear in the next couple of minutes, I think there's a lot that we science communicators might be able to learn from good or best practices that are used in other sectors that are commonly called marketing. Why are we doing this? Why is there a problem, or are we synthesizing a problem? As Mary has said quite clearly, the good news is that the American public really likes science a lot, and they really trust scientists a lot. So why is there a concern? Well, the problem is, as you look more deeply, you find that that support doesn't necessarily translate when it comes to appropriating priorities or dollars. And a couple of surveys were done, not by ScienceCounts, but were done previously, that indicated, they basically posed the question, if we have a deficit and if you wanted to decrease the federal deficit, which federal program would you cut first? And 9 programs were given, 9 or 10. And unfortunately, in 2011, again in 2015, and then this was also repeated very recently as well, science research is at the top or near the top of programs to cut. Now, that is certainly not good news, and that begs the question, how can Americans like science so much but be willing to see it cut? Let me point out, if you're looking at this slide, that if you look about halfway down, you'll see medical research. Medical research was broken out separately from scientific research, and I think the folks who designed the study did that very wisely, because you can make an argument that scientific research is sort of a proxy for basic research, which is the type of research that many of us feel would be the first to go. And then medical research, at least from a public's point of view, see that a little bit more as applied. All you have to do is ask someone, why is science valuable? And the answer you will invariably get has to do with biomedicine or health. It cures cancer. It helps with this disease or with this condition. So that's the problem we face. And the first step is to understand the dynamic. Why is this apparent paradox? Let me also make this a little bit more real in terms of scale. If you look at funding for basic research, the largest source is the federal government. By measures, anywhere from about 50 to 60% of funding for basic research is the federal government, which is, to be conservative, about $50 billion. Philanthropy, so Gates Foundation and Moore Foundation, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and others, their annual giving is on the order of about $2 billion. So there's significant concern that even modest cuts in federal support for basic research cannot be readily made up for by other forms of support, like philanthropy. Okay, so the stakes are big, and we really are, don't want to imagine what might happen, even with what may seem like modest cuts at the federal level. ScienceCounts is a 501c3 organization, nonprofit organization that was formed in 2014, so we're a pretty young organization, and we were formed with the help of a handful of professional science societies, American Physical Society, AAAS, Society for Neuroscience, among others, to focus specifically on the relationship between science, the field of science, the community of science, and the general public. We look outside the Beltway. We want to understand what's going on in the minds and the hearts of Americans when you talk about science, and American science in particular. But a key part of this is to bring together a community of vested stakeholders, and there's a bunch of logos here that represent our community, which is growing every day. But we have professional science societies, we have philanthropy, independent laboratories, academia, and very importantly, and certainly not least, the private sector and the industry, to pull all in the same direction, because we all sort of share a common value in the private sector, public sector engine that the United States has really relied on since World War II for the last 3 generations. So our hypothesis in looking at this problem and framing it is, can we use conventional marketing practices to get some new insights into what's going on or not going on with regards to public perception of science? And so we've imagined, in essence, what is a classic market research study or branding study, which also follows the scientific method, where we wanted to get some observations, do some real fine, high-resolution studies of public perception of science, and I'm going to share some of that data here. Then we wanted to take that and actually conduct science communication experiments, which is something that's actually not done all that often because of, frankly, the expense and the complexity of doing so. And we have, in conjunction with Research America, an experiment that's going on right now. We'll be wrapping up in a couple of months. And then the hope is, once we can learn how to more effectively make a value proposition to the American public, that we can scale that up and communicate to the public effectively. So 2 years ago, we conducted a national benchmark segmentation survey that involved about 2,000 participants. It was a very beefy survey. It had 52 questions, and the reason it had 52 questions was it asked a lot of the same questions twice. What do you think about science? How does this make you feel? The reason it asked the questions twice was sandwiched in between were some stories and examples about how government funding of basic research or government partnership with industry has led to innovative products that we all rely on every day. And so after hearing or reading those stories, we wanted to see if participants' points of view had changed at all. In other words, a plasticity or a flexibility test. That work was then followed up with 2 batteries of focus groups, and focus groups are invaluable, allowing you to really probe into the kind of the emotional and cognitive processes that are behind people's opinions and beliefs. And then we did some initial testing of some messages, and we actually tested some of the conventional messages that are being used by the science community and various science outreach and science education initiatives to see, how did they land on the public. Before I share the data, I just want kind of a few contextual remarks. First of all, again, the subject of our study was public perception, and so the conclusions I'm going to share with you here reflect that, not necessarily how one would communicate with policymakers or other audiences. I'm going to use the word science a lot, but it was very apparent in our study that the public does not clearly differentiate between science, technology, engineering, or mathematics. They think of them as an equivalent bucket, if you will. So I think a lot of the findings we have here are largely applicable to technology, engineering, and mathematics as well. The public absolutely does not distinguish between basic and applied research. A lot of us here spend time worrying about that. The general public has a challenge understanding what research is in the first place. They don't worry about the modifier before the word research. And then we steered clear of controversial science communication issues like climate change and evolution, because once you bring those up, you sort of get people's defenses up. So the first step was to test via word association sentiment with certain words and terms. And so we asked a battery of terms. And what you see here is the positive or favorable rating for each of these terms. So the terms that people felt the best about were aspirational terms like discovery or invention or innovation. And the ones they felt the least warm and fuzzy about were terms that, as you can see here, the small circles that involved words like federal, but more importantly, I believe, economic terms like investment or funded, things about money. And that was very interesting to see from the get-go. One of the goals of the work was you'd like to have segmentation data if you're going to engage an audience. There is no the public. And so you'd like to know, what are particular sub-audiences. And so with those 52 questions, we were able to identify 4 different clusters in the populace. You could think of the public as falling into 4 different buckets. And we've labeled them drivers, front seaters, back seaters, and disengaged. And those terms represent the likelihood that those folks are willing to participate in an activity. to go beyond just saying I like science, but am I willing to change my day planner next week to actually do something in support of science? And so we found that about 17% of Americans would be considered drivers, and this is your choir. These are folks who are primed to actually go out and do something, followed by front-seaters, back-seaters, and then disengaged, and the disengaged have no interest in participating on this issue whatsoever. Now, I'm sure everyone's curious to know who are these people, what do they look like? And so at the highest level, here's some demographic information. And let me translate the icons down the left side here. And so what you're seeing is, you're seeing geography, gender ratio, male-female, age, ethnicity, education, meaning 4-year degree or higher, home ownership, average size of household, ideological balance between liberal and conservative, and it's helpful to know that Americans, about a quarter of Americans identify as liberals, about a quarter identify as conservatives, and everyone else is in between or doesn't like labels. Below that is religiosity, you practice of faith, and then at the bottom was the likelihood you would vote in the upcoming presidential election. This survey, again, was done late in 2015. And so when you look at the drivers, there weren't a whole lot of surprises here. These are your NPR listeners. You have primarily white, older, relatively financially sound, relatively liberal people living on the coast. And this is the group that the March for Science organically somewhat drew from. So that was somewhat of an accidental, helpful experiment. Looking on the other side, you see the disengaged, and the disengaged actually are the youngest group, and that's a bit of a concern. They have the highest concentrations of millennials, which was a bit surprising. But if you also look at the makeup, you'll see that this group participates in everything the least. So they are the least religious, they are the least likely to vote. So there's a sense of a general apathy that's driving the disengaged, not necessarily any kind of antagonism towards science, which is something some folks worry about, a large minority of Americans who are just anti-science, period. Okay. What's wonderful, though, if you're a marketer, is that we have data that's even higher resolution, and you can really go down and essentially get, in essence, the line spectra for subpopulations. And this chart is a little bit challenging to read the first couple times you see it, but let me just navigate us through to show you the power and why this is so useful to science communicators and understanding your audience. Just looking at the top here, that top row that has the word health on the right side, these are responses to the question that say the issues that should be an urgent focus of scientific research. So we'll take health, for instance. And these are looking at two different variables simultaneously. From left to right, you see the percentage of survey participants that said that, yes, it is urgent. So the further to the right, the more you care. And we have separated out vertically liberals from moderates from conservatives, and these are self-identified ideological representations. And then the shape of the icon has to do with education. And just to translate this, the more sides the shape has, the more education you have. So squares have 4-year degree or higher, triangles some college, circles or high school or less. And so just looking down this, you can see there are stark differences on issues that polarize groups in different ways. Health, everybody thinks health is important. That's not a surprise. When you look at environment, liberals feel more strongly about the environment than conservatives, not a terrible surprise. If you look at the role of science in military, you see the inverse. You see that for conservatives, the role of science in improving national defense.
Hello?
Hi, this is Ana Briceño, your moderator for today. Looks like we're having just minor audio issues. So if you just hang on just a moment, we'll get that figured out. Again, apologize for that. Just one moment. Hello, everyone. Again, this is Ana Briceño, your moderator for today's webinar. We're currently having a minor audio issue, and we will fix that shortly. Appreciate your patience. Hold on just one moment, please. Thank you. Hello, this is Ana Briceño, your moderator for today's webinar. Since we're experiencing minor audio issues, we want to go ahead and ask a question to all those who are the panelists for today from one of the speakers until we get the audio squared away. So we do have a question from one of the audience members, and the question is, what tips do you have for talking about complex issues like animal research? Navneet or Mary, if you're on the line, would you like to answer that question?
This is Mary. Thanks, Anna. I think that it's important when being asked about complex questions to first identify that you can tell that the questioner is being skeptical, is raising an issue or has doubts about a particular area of science. And by connecting with someone around the concept of being skeptical, you can also say that as a scientist, you're trained to be skeptical and to ask questions. So you're changing the conversation and the dialogue into that more of people with shared approach to a topic, asking questions. And then, in addition, that let's say it's a controversial issue like animal research or stem cell research. And if you personally are conducting research in that area, it's important to acknowledge that and explain what it is that you're doing, not in scientific detail, but rather in aspirational terms. In short, what is it that you're trying to solve, find a solution for, rather than specific scientific methodology. Navneet, you might want to weigh in as well.
So I want to add on Mary. I agree with Mary totally. Handling these issues, scientists should be always aware that, be compassionate as much as possible, not just for the animals on which you do research, but also to the society and the community as a whole. And try to explain your point about why do you think this is important to do in the interest of the society as a whole in health science research. So it's important to be more, conversational and communicative about the needs of the society and how you're addressing it.
Great. Thank you so much. Again, to all the attendees, we apologize that we lost some of the audio. We are working fast to correct that. But in the meantime, I'm actually going to turn it over to our third speaker, Dr. Matharu, to talk about science communication and her experience with the 3-minute thesis. So, Dr. Matharu, is this a good time?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you to Research America and Society of Neuroscience for inviting me to speak. And good afternoon to East Coast and bright sunny morning to the Pacific Coast. This is Navneet Matharu with you for next 15 minutes. Let me start by sharing with you my personal story about communicating science. I had a tryst with distilling my complex science into simple one around 15 years ago when my grandma demanded a biology lesson. what genetics means. She knew I was doing master's in genetics. I had to scratch my head to think, what should I tell her? I started by explaining her genetics on the basis that I do look a lot like her, and so on. I cannot forget that day she was so thrilled and went to talk about science of genetics with her oldies around neighborhood. I am sure all of us had experienced a different form of the same story. You'll all agree with me that by sharing the excitement of research, you not only can encourage people around you to think in a scientific manner, but also reassure your worthiness of doing science altogether. So, as alluded by Chris and Mary, that despite having positive opinion about science in public, there are visible gaps in scientific understanding among different sections of society. And what I'm going to talk briefly today is how we as scientists can help in bridging this gap through effective science communication, with special focus on popular 3-minute thesis format. The setting of these forums and platforms where you can freely communicate science essentially act as bridges where knowledge sharing can take place. As you may realize that bridge infrastructures usually have positive, productive impact on society and economy. Let's introspect how this communication or bridging can work out. Even to start with, why we should communicate. Of course, it's an essential need of a thriving society. I would like to discuss here 2 scenarios presenting different frame of mind of that of a communicator. Should we communicate as knowledge imparting model, where we recognize an information deficit that we know something that you don't know? And because we as scientists have epistemic privilege, these arguments work well in educational settings, but may prove to be counterintuitive in public settings or layman. The second scenario is where scientists think it to be a knowledge-sharing process and forget epistemic privilege for a while. The biggest advantage of this model is that it should allow public or audience to realize that them as an important part of the process of science communication. This brings us to how we should communicate science. Again, I am presenting here 2 frame of mind models where scientists are considered separate entity to layman public, and scientists can share scientific research facts as they are in purely factual format. This kind of communication works well, rather encouraged in academic peer settings, but doesn't work effectively in public. The second model here is the value addition and embrace model. Here, first, the mindset of a science communicator is aligned with that of audience or public, so that all together, scientists and public can embrace a scientific fact and can put values to it. Now, this is a real challenge for scientists as they now have to balance facts, findings, and conceptual logic with those of values, narratives, and feeling components. And to top it, there is a 3-minute thesis format that is hugely popular because of its concise, effective, and compelling nature, where you have to present your science in 3 minutes to non-expert audience in non-expert language. Next few slides, I'll be discussing with you how we can crack this 3-minute thesis format. So remember these 6 points in 3 minutes. I have listed them as along the trajectory of your 3-minute art. First, start from respecting your audience, collective intelligence, and together wonder about facts. Connect to them by sharing and bringing them into your big picture dream, but in a simple language. Build a common goal and inspire or attract them to it, because your dream matters to all of us. Project your idea or solution to a problem and let them think about it. This will make them prospect the validity of your idea. Build trust and confidence with them so that they want to know more about your research. So on basis of these points, you can now script your 3-minute into 3 main sections and 2 connector sections. An opening section is typically 10 to 30 seconds long. This is the most effective section where you lead your audience with a hook that can be central theme of your entire 3 minutes. Your hook should be easily relatable. It can be an interesting fact, an analogy, or even a humor. But remember, it should be a really polished humor, an absolutely non-controversial one. Next is your first connector, when you connect your hook or opening to your research or research question. Third section is a body of your 3 minutes, where you present a simple, jargon-free, easy-to-grasp scientific explanation of your research. Make sure to use one word or a phrase to one scientific concept. Remember that each scientific concept here needs explanation, so to keep it short, explain the most important one, but effectively. This section is where audience is prone to tune off, so stop before the drag sets in. The second connector is a little longer, where you tell what you decide to do. Remember here, you project your idea to audience, and together, along with them, you're prospecting it. Your closing section of your 3 minute can be sharp, mic drop, or brief narrative that connects your presentation back to the hook. This keeps your audience memory in loop. All these sections should be well-rounded and connectors should be well in place. So remember that active verbs are direct and better to use than indirective passive verbs that can confuse your audience. Shorter, simple sentences are easy to grasp than longer, complicated ones. Mention one word and keep using it for your recurring scientific concept, and be smarter about introducing new scientific concepts one after the other. In other words, avoid throwing multiple explanations or many concepts. So, as I mentioned, don't try to say too many things. Don't use jargons or talk in a monotone. Metaphors, stories, and analogies or emotional connects work wonder in 3 minutes. Give relatable examples like, do you know a human body carries 10 times more bacterial cells than its own body cells? Or you can pose a question like, total length of a DNA in your body can be stretched to moon and back. So audience can take these surprising facts with them, and it's good for you to be remembered as a science communicator. So next, when you're ready, after having a well-knit script for your 3 minute, you can road test your style with your friends and family to see if they are tuned in with your hook or humor. Also, you want audience of all colors with you, so steer away from any controversial humor or subject. You will get lots of feedback. Now put your diligence and what to include, what not to include, and come to a solidified script. So now your script is ready. So how you present your 3 minutes. While presenting your 3 minutes, see if you're enunciating clearly and not running through. Remember your script because you won't have time for those voice fillers like mms and uhs. So rather use these fillers can tune off your audience actually. So also practice your body language for presentation style. A poised, calm, confident look is preferable. You can play around with the voice modulations, tones, eye contacts, hand gestures, but remember, don't just speak to one person sitting, or don't be fixated on one kind of hand gestures. For each section of your 3 minutes, you can change your body language. Like for an opening, emotional expression can work. Easiest one is to smile and engage your audience. For body of your 3 minutes, you are telling scientific concepts and facts. You should come through as a confident, eloquent, yet humble. So use pauses. When you are presenting your idea or a solution to a problem or a challenge, show your enthusiasm, passion, excitement, but all in controlled manner. For closing, you should come through as credible, trustworthy, and likable to your audience. So along with describing your work, you should be able to show enthusiasm, passion for your research to audience, and emotionally connect to them to have a feel for your research. That's most important and can make your audience happy to know about it. So doing so, your frame of mind matters during science communication, and you may have to step out of your sciencey comfort zone to really make a difference. It's not actually difficult to do. We have two big examples in front of us. Here is one. To connect to common public, NASA went social. Its astronauts left their comfort zones. Actually, not that comfortable if you think of all the physical trainings they have to go through in simulators and whatnot, but surely they were successful in bridging gaps. That's what data shows. Second one, when common public turned to be AIDS activists and they actively engaged researchers and scientists to seek knowledge by pushing them out of their comfort zones. Surprisingly, this struck a chord. To end here, remember to strike a chord by telling your story. Generalize it enough so they can feel. Personalize it so they remember you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Navneet. Those are some wonderful tips. Thank you for sharing that. For those of you who are waiting to hear the closing remarks from Chris Volpe, we'd like to invite him back on the line to share some final thoughts. Now, Chris, we'd like you to share a few final thoughts before we jump over to Q&A.
Terrific, thank you. And can you hear me? Am I loud and clear?
Yes.
Wonderful, and I apologize for that. Not sure what happened. In regards to the conclusions, I'm going to use Navneet's tips here and keep it to 3 minutes or less. What we found in terms of the big problem or the big concern is this idea that only 1 in 4 Americans feel that the role of the federal government in supporting science is required. That if that were to go away or diminish, that the other key players in the space, most notably the private sector, but also philanthropy and academia, would step in and fill any gap. And earlier I shared the scale of the numbers involved here in terms of dollars. That is not reality. So that's the concern. If that perception ever becomes policy, we're all in for a rough ride. In terms of the key findings, I would say there are two. First is the segmentation that I went through, and you always want to know and fine-tune your message to your audience so that you can relate to them and to their value set and to their worldview as much as possible. But it's also this idea that I think we've got an idea of what the brand of science is, that science is hope. And what that means is when you say science to someone, they hear the word hope. And so that's invaluable because that means that they're expecting hopeful messages from us. It doesn't mean we always have to give them that. Certainly there are some issues. Sometimes we have to deliver bad news. But we have to be prepared that when we deliver bad news, we have to be able to pivot and try to find a way to end hopefully or looking forward or being optimistic. Otherwise, we are going to face a pushback. And if you look at the issues that have polarized us as a country around science, I think you'll see that in fact is the case. So I would just wrap up by saying that we're really excited, where I think we have the best glimpse of how the general public sees science and scientists through their eyes. They see us as sources of good news, as servants of the public good, and we just have to, sort of, when we deliver messages and a value proposition, we have to make sure that we build on that and connect with people and show how the things that they already care about that are non-scientific are aided or helped by the things that we do and work so hard at in science. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Chris. And now we're going to be answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. As a reminder, you can submit written questions through the question pane. So one of the questions that we have is, how well do you think science-specific social media, podcasts, webinars, etc., are reaching the lay public?
Well, this is Mary. I'll start off on that. I think it matters immensely what channel is being used to communicate via social media. So if it is NPR podcast, it's reaching those drivers that Chris described in the segmentation slide. If it's general Twitter, it's reaching a much broader group, obviously, and we could go on that way. Social media, though, is something that is being tested right now with ScienceCounts work in progress. So maybe, Chris, you could say a few words about it.
Sure, and what I would say is, as underline what Mary said, where if you want to reach a specific audience, the first step is to understand where they're already getting their information and what channels and outlets are they already tuned into, and try to leverage those as opposed to having them tune into new channels. I think the key, which is the foundation of the question also, is what is our objective or what's our goal? I'm a science advocate. I want folks to get excited and support science. And so, I don't want to tell them science is more important than these other things that you care about, family, health, national security. I want to show them how science is a cornerstone to those values they already care about. And once you do that, you basically have already been now invited into the channels that people are already listening to.
Great, thank you. And many of you are asking about the presentation and if it will be available after the webinar concludes, and the answer is yes, it will be available on Neuroline. So the second question that we have is for our panelists is, do you have any tips for translating your scientific research for policymakers and policy-specific focused publications?
Well, I'll start off again. I hope others will consider being part of this conversation. So it goes back to that know your audience point that all of us have brought out. So it depends on who your audience is. If it's a meeting with a member of Congress or their staffer, it's really important to be clear about what it is you want that person to do, what you want them to vote for or against, what you want them, how you would answer the question, what do you want me to do, literally, and not be about your latest work in a scientific journal. In other words, a kind of educational model of informing. A meeting with a member of Congress is not the place to do that. So if it's for a publication that, if you want to be involved in influencing policy through a publication, again, you have to think about what publication and for what audience. Is it a publication in USA Today or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times? Those reach different audiences, very different audiences, maybe a little bit of overlap, but they're quite different. If it's I personally always recommend local hard copy or the social media equivalent of hard copy newspapers to reach congressional representatives, because they are always monitored by congressional staff. So that can be a letter to the editor on a science-related topic, or it could be an unsolicited op-ed. But again, in a local publication, you will have very high readership by a member of Congress or their staff on their behalf. So others might want to weigh in as well.
Well, this is Chris, and this is outside, my area of expertise for sure. But I would say, in general, to build on exactly what Mary said, that the challenge is people are going to care when it's relevant to their worldview, when it's relevant to their objectives and their goals. And so that's where the translation, a key part of the translation is, whatever your research is, depending on who your audience is, the translation is how do you show that that work is relevant to either the issue at hand that they're considering or in general the things that they prioritize as being important.
Great. Thank you, Chris. So we do hope that you found this presentation useful, and we encourage you to continue the conversation on the Neuroline community afterwards. I did mention at the top of the hour that this is the very first of a series of webinars brought to you by Research America and SFN, and registration is open for the other webinars, so please check that out. And a big thank you again to all of the panelists for generously sharing your time with us, and thank you for everyone for joining today's webinar. Of course, we welcome your feedback, so please do take a moment to take the post-survey webinar. And again, thank you for your time today, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Anna. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
So this is from yesterday.